In June 2012, Julian Assange walked into the Ecuadorian embassy in London seeking asylum. His WikiLeaks website had published thousands of US military documents. Sweden wanted him over an alleged sexual assault, and he faced possible extradition. What has changed in the last 6 years? Is he any closer to leaving the embassy? You're watching Roundtable with me, Shuli Ghosh. The Ecuadorian government offered Julian Assange a safe haven over fears he would be forced to face trial in the US. But Ecuador has a new president, and he says Assange is a nuisance. Does it mean Assange is about to be pushed out? And if so, what happens next?
For 6 years, Ecuador's embassy in London has been home for WikiLeaks founder Julian Assange. Its main office turned studio apartment has provided refuge from possible extradition to the United States. But after years in confinement and little movement on his legal status, why is the Ecuadorian government still offering him a political safe haven? In 2012, Ecuador's President Rafael Correa offered Assange asylum. It followed the publishing of thousands of US military documents on his WikiLeaks website related to the Afghanistan and Iraq wars.
It's time to call out WikiLeaks for what it really is: a non-state hostile intelligence service often abetted by state actors like Russia.
The controversy has fueled Assange's position as a champion of free speech.
As WikiLeaks stands under threat, so does the freedom of expression and the health of all our societies.
But why did Ecuador step in to help protect this computer hacker turned political activist? At the time, Assange was also wanted in Sweden to face questions over an alleged sexual assault and rape. He broke bail to enter the embassy after exhausting all legal options to avoid extradition, and eventually Sweden was forced to drop its rape investigation in 2017. But a warrant is still out for his arrest in Britain for failing to surrender to court. Assange's stay at the embassy has cost Ecuador millions of dollars. On Britain's side, surveillance has also cost millions in a bid to arrest him if he leaves. The Ecuadorian government says it's protecting Assange over fears he won't face a fair trial if sent to the United States. It's a lot of money for what appears to be a political standoff with the United States. In the past few months, there's been a shift in Assange's protection at the embassy. Ecuador's new president has cut resources, including internet access, to prevent him from voicing his political opinions online. Are these new limitations a soft way to flush Assange out? Australian government officials have recently been seen visiting the embassy following Britain's decision to uphold his arrest warrant. So 6 years into his stay at the Ecuadorian embassy, things are beginning to change. Assange no longer has the full support of the Ecuadorian government, and there are signs his health is suffering. But where to next? The threat of extradition to the US is still very real, and he's a wanted man in Britain.
Well, joining us today from Geneva is Jennifer Robinson, a human rights lawyer who is representing Julian Assange. In New York is Randolph Credico, a political satirist who has visited Assange at the Ecuadorian embassy 3 times and has produced a radio series called Assange's Count to Freedom. Here with me in the studio is Latin America analyst Javier Farje and Naomi Colvin, director of the Courage Foundation, an organisation that supports whistleblowers and hacktivists, including Assange. Welcome to all my guests today. Randolph, let me start with you because you saw Assange just a few months ago. I'm guessing he never expected to be at the embassy this long.
No, I saw him in November. November 13th was the last time I was there. And I thought by now he would be out myself. I'm sure that he thought he would be out. We thought he'd be out a year ago. This has gone on way too long. It's ridiculous. The court system in Britain is totally rigged from our perspective over here. They should not have this bail charge against Julian Assange. There are tens of thousands of people running around Great Britain who have skipped bail. They're not following these people. They spent $17, $18 million following Assange, surveilling Assange, and that money could be better spent for public housing in Great Britain at this point.
Just tell us a little bit about how he's coping with the incarceration, because several people have said that he's not looking well.
When I saw him the last time, and Jennifer has seen him much more recently, he looked very well to me. This is back in November. He still has a great sense of humor. I think he's a little homesick. I think he misses his kids, his mother. We talked about dogs. We talked about general things the last time I was there. And not really about specifics of the case. Okay. And he's just, you know, he's a normal individual.
Let me bring in Jennifer. The legal status of Assange, the investigation in Sweden of the alleged sexual assault was dropped, but it is the case that he still faces arrest if he were to leave the embassy, which seems quite bizarre.
That's correct. The Swedish investigation was dropped over 18 months ago. This is a case that was dragged on for many years in circumstances where Julian was offering his testimony. But here we are, 18 months later, and there's no progress. He's still inside the embassy because of the concern about risk to extradition to the United States.
And we don't know whether the UK and the US have had that conversation. We don't know how big that risk is.
The UK refuses to confirm or deny whether or not there is an extradition request. We're unable to get any information about it, and if there is an indictment, it will be sealed, which means it's a criminal offence to disclose the fact that there is an indictment. So Julian's in this insidious position that he has protection from Ecuador, but he does not know for sure what will happen. We suspect there's an indictment, and if he comes out and is arrested by the Brits to face potential bail proceedings, he will be in custody, at which time the US can unseal an indictment and request his extradition. So it's a very difficult situation. No publisher ought to be extradited to the US to face prosecution for their publishing activities.
Okay, Javier, the fact that the new president of Ecuador, Lenin Moreno, has called him a costly inherited problem. What does that tell you about the commitment Ecuador now has towards continuing to protect?
Well, President Moreno is under the obligation to keep on protecting him because of his status as a political, as a refugee and as an Ecuadorian citizen, because he's got that. But he can't wait to get rid of him. That is the fact. He said it many times before. He's a nuisance. You use the word nuisance. He actually used that very word when he talked up, when he was interviewed by El País in January this year, the Spanish newspaper, because what President Moreno wants to do is take a distance from his predecessor's policies, President Correa, and he wants to be his own man. He's actually taken many measures which I don't know if we're going to have the time to talk about it now, but basically Assange is one of the issues in which he wants to take his own decisions about that. He cut the internet because he believed that Mr. Assange's interference in the Catalonian pro-independence movement was unacceptable because of the rules of asylum. That's one of the rules. I know that because I was a refugee for 12 years. I know how that works. You can't interfere in this kind of things, but also...
So the decision to cut the internet was a deliberate attempt to stop Assange communicating with the outside world and continuing his work with WikiLeaks.
Yeah, but there's two reasons why the government in Ecuador argues that he had to do that. First of all, because of the way he interfered in the Catalonian issue of the independence. He supported the pro-independence, which is not the official position of the Ecuadorian government. The Ecuadorian government supports the government of Madrid. But second, an alleged exchange of information, direct messages between him and the Trump family, which I don't know whether there's been evidence, but that's one of the reasons they argued that if you keep on doing that, Moreno's attempts to reestablish a better relationship with the West, especially the US and the UK, you know, it's going to be, this is an obstacle for that. And what is not helping is the stubbornness of the British government to maintain this arrest warrant because he jumped bail. It's totally absurd. It's a political decision, let's face it. And that makes it very difficult for President Moreno to try to find a way to solve the situation. That stubbornness is making it very difficult for everyone.
What do you make of all of this, Naomi, and particularly the fact that the internet was cut for Julian Assange?
Yes, I totally agree with your previous speaker that the bail offence being potential bail offence being upheld is ridiculous. And I think it's a very good example of the way that the process in this case is odd, and Julian is being treated slightly differently from anyone else.
Why do you think that is? Why would the UK make that decision? Because it went to court and the judge looked at it and then said, we're going to uphold the bail.
Well, the key thing is it's very weird that it actually went to court, because in any other case where the underlying offence had disappeared, it would just be negotiated away and the lawyers would deal with it. Yeah. It's very, very odd that it's got to this situation anyway. But you asked about the communications. I think it's true that there's all kinds of issues about Julian being in the embassy and how that relates to Ecuadorian foreign policy, and that's true. However, I think that his internet access being cut off at this time, when we know that there's negotiations going on between Ecuador and the UK and Australia are now involved, that Julian, and from his central position, is not able to comment on what is going on, has a slightly sinister aspect to me, and I think that's quite concerning. I also think that the restriction of his physical visitors is very concerning. At the Courage Foundation, we work with a lot of information activists and whistleblowers who are incarcerated, and this is the kind of thing that happens. And it's a means of punishment, and it's a way of sort of psychologically pressuring people. And so from a personal point of view, a humanitarian point of view, I think the restriction of visitors is extremely concerning as well.
What about the argument that as far as the internet goes, and maybe you can comment on this, Randolph, that Assange brought it on himself because of WikiLeaks dropping all those the leaked emails from the Hillary Clinton's Democrat representatives in the lead up to the election, which was welcomed by Trump, but has since been seen as a huge intelligence leak in the US.
Well, first of all, I welcome him dropping that information, because I was a Bernie Sanders supporter, and the entire primary system was rigged by the Democratic National Committee. And if they had let Sanders and the whole thing run out on its own without the DNC being involved in it, Donald Trump wouldn't be the president today. They are the ones that colluded. I'm talking about the DNC and keeping Sanders off the general election ballot and giving it to Trump. He would have won that election, and so we saw the crimes that were committed by the DNC if not for Julian Assange. So what he did was great publishing. What are we not supposed to know about it? I want to know. I'm an American citizen. I pay taxes. I'd like to know what these politicians are doing.
But doesn't it mean that he is now a person of interest in the Russian collusion investigation, and Robert Mueller very much wants to speak to him?
It's ridiculous. I'm a person of interest in the Russian investigation. I got called by Mueller the other day, they'd like to interview me. I had nothing to do with this. He had nothing to do with this. There was no transfer of information to the Trump
but none of this helps Julian Assange's case, particularly when you have the White House talking about WikiLeaks' revelation of the classified CIA hacking tools. Mike Pompeo calling WikiLeaks a hostile, non-state intelligence agency. Jennifer, that can only mean one thing, that there is much more pressure to keep Julian Assange incarcerated as long as possible.
Of course, I mean, the asylum that he was granted by Ecuador was justified at the time. He had a legitimate fear of persecution in the US if he's returned there. That risk has only increased over time with these statements from the CIA director saying that WikiLeaks is a hostile non-state intelligence agency and that the CIA will take them down, that he will not benefit from free speech protections. And in these circumstances, we are very concerned about the way that he will be treated, particularly with the politicization of the WikiLeaks publications around the last election, the Russia criminal investigation, and the we say exaggerated allegations that are being made about WikiLeaks' supposed collusion with Russia, for which there's no evidence. It's an incredibly serious and politicized situation that no publisher ought to be sent to face prosecution.
Presumably you agree with that, so that free speech. Others would say it was quite a cynical, politicized move on behalf of WikiLeaks.
No, I mean, look, we're not, I mean, people use the phrase free speech and throw it around. Let's be clear about what we're talking about. The right to publish is also the right to read. It's the right to be informed. It's the right to understand what is going on in the world and therefore take action about it. We have, over the past decade, this current wave of whistleblowing has led to people being more informed about what's going on and what's been going on in their name and able to take action about it. You know, document disclosure is a really key catalyst for social action, and this is why it needs to be defended. And I think maybe in some ways the issues have become more clouded since 2010. We need to regain some focus here. If we end up in a situation where a US extradition request comes down for Julian Assange to be extradited to the US, to be prosecuted for publishing information that the US does not want published, this will be an absolute disaster, not just for us who are involved in information activism, but people involved in a whole range of progressive campaigns and trying to make the world a better place. This is a sort of, it's a case of generational importance.
You're saying it's wider than the whole issue of whether Julian Assange is going to remain in the Ecuadorian embassy.
It's absolutely massive, and yes, the sort of what's happening currently around the embassy is a key part of that. But you know, I'm very focused, I think, on this threat of extradition to the United States. You know, and it's very clear to me, look, I've worked on extradition cases before. Courage won a US extradition case earlier this year in the case of information activist Lowry Love. These are highly political cases. It is not a straightforward legal ticking the box procedure. A US extradition request will only be allowed to go ahead by the UK if the UK allows it to happen. And that's where we need to, and that's really where everybody...
So presumably that's one of the issues that the UK was thinking about when it was deciding whether the bail warrant was still...
I think so. I think we have to follow that through, and yeah, that concerns me. I think the UK has really failed to act particularly honourably in this case. It's disregarded international institutions of asylum, and it's sort of rejected out of hand the verdicts even after appeal of US advisory
regardless of how political this is becoming, he can't
good.
stay in that embassy forever, can he?
No, he can't, and Moreno wants him out. And let me play devil's advocate here, reluctantly. If you send a tweet saying that the arrest of Carles Puigdemont, the fugitive former president of the Catalonian autonomy region, by the German authorities, you compare that to the arrest of Companys, the former, during the Second World War, the former president of the Catalonian by the Gestapo, then you have a problem. You can't use certain expressions. He made life very difficult for himself by comparing the current government with the Nazi regime. It's something very delicate for the Ecuadorian government, who has given him refuge and shelter, and he used his Twitter account to make this expression. It was very unfortunate by him. At the same time, listen, the problem with Assange, he knows too much about many things. And that makes him a dangerous person. These links with Russia are very murky. We don't really know exactly what's going on there. His so-called campaign against Clinton makes it there are too many things which are very unclear. But also
there was a Guardian newspaper report recently saying that the whole surveillance operation on Assange, which has been continuing 24/7 and runs into tens of thousands of pounds per month, has changed from an operation to protect him to more of one spying on him. The Guardian claims to have seen documents where all his visitors are logged, etc.
Yeah, but former President Correa spent around $5 million in this security scheme to protect him from being spied on and things like that. That was criticized by President Moreno when he took office a year ago in May last year. Now, this is very, very important to emphasize that the Guardian, together with El País in Spain and other newspapers, were on Assange's side for a while, until all this murky thing about Russia came out, and they have taken distance. El País has just recently published an editorial saying, Assange, we respect what he did in 2010 when he infiltrated these documents from Chelsea Manning. Now he's lost that credibility. So that's a problem for him. But at the same time, the problem is that Moreno needs to reestablish better relations with the countries with whom Ecuador didn't have good relations because of the policies of President Correa. Whether you agree with that or not, that's a different matter.
So Ecuador is now trying to make better relations.
Listen, I agree with you. I think they're trying to make his life impossible for him. So you know what? Go. We don't want you here. You're not welcome here. You used to be welcome here, but this is a completely new government. This is a completely new situation. We want you here. And for as long as the British government maintains this nonsense about this jumping bail arrest, things are going to be very difficult. I think they should drop that, because it makes it to be suspicious about why they are keeping this case if there's no links with the US about a possible deportation for him to the US.
Okay.
You have to be suspicious if the government has this stubborn attitude towards the situation in relation to Julian Assange.
Randolph or Jennifer or both of you, having seen Assange. Is he aware of this turning tide? Is he worried that he might be losing the support of the Ecuadorians?
I'll defer to Jennifer.
He is, of course, concerned about the changing geopolitical circumstances in Ecuador, which will inevitably have an impact on his case and on his situation, and indeed the politics of negotiation, which will hopefully result in his release. The circumstances inside the embassy are very difficult. He is cut off from visitors. He is cut off from the internet. He is cut off from telephone calls. He's only able to see us as his lawyers, which is, you know, he was already in a serious situation. He hasn't been outside for 6 years, no sunlight, no outdoor area to exercise, and now cut off from the world, and in circumstances that even Human Rights Watch has recognised is you can't distinguish between his circumstances and solitary confinement anymore. And it's time that a political negotiation has to be found. And we believe Ecuador has done the right thing, the principled thing in granting him asylum. And we must recognise that Ecuador is a small country that has come under significant political pressure. So we cannot be judgmental about the difficulties that they've faced as a result of granting him protection.
How can he be arrested if he is technically an Ecuador diplomat? Wasn't he made an Ecuador diplomat?
Yeah, but he's still jump bail. It doesn't matter whether he becomes
So he doesn't get diplomatic protection?
Well, the possibility of sneaking him out of the embassy through in a car had been considered apparently by the government, which he wouldn't have worked because if he would have been arrested, would have grabbed the car and arrested him. They were exploring the possibility of making him a diplomat, giving him some kind of diplomatic status like in Washington or something. But the government here is not going to let that happen. I mean, again, one wonders whether there's a political element in the stubbornness of the British government to maintain this arrest warrant against him. But yes, they could try that, but they've tried before. We mustn't forget it's not the first time they tried to get him out. But they know very well that he would be arrested if he leaves, even if he's an Ecuadorian citizen, because he's still under sort of an arrest warrant. And the only way, I think, for this situation to be solved is that they lift this arrest warrant against him and let him go to Ecuador. And of course, because of the rules of asylum, he would have to comply with that even if he lives in Ecuador, because that's the only country I would imagine that he would go to Ecuador, because he's at the end of the day an Ecuadorian citizen. But he will have to comply with certain rules. Like he might be told, look, we are going to let you go, but you just shut up. And of course, that's not something that he's going to do easily, right, because again, he has too much information. He knows too much about too many things for him to keep quiet. And why should he anyway?
Regardless of what happens to Assange, what impact has his case had on journalism and whistleblowing, both in the UK and particularly in the US?
It's changed the game entirely. Big collaborations between lots of different media organisations on document sets. It's sort of regular practice now. It wasn't before WikiLeaks. The number of news organisations around the world and civil society organisations who now have online drop boxes for people to submit documents anonymously. WikiLeaks has entirely changed the game, and history will be very kind, I think, to Julian in his contribution here. But if we want this to happen, we really need to do something to stand up for his situation now. There's lots of protests going on outside Ecuadorian embassies and US embassies around the world today. In London, there's a big demo going outside the Ecuadorian embassy from 6 p.m. today. I'm sure they'd appreciate people coming along. I think that as it becomes more obvious that the situation is actually incredibly serious, and we are back to this situation that everybody was worried about and really concerned about in 2010, 2011, that people will gradually realise that no, this is a massive generational battle. We are not going to let the world's biggest military power dictate what everyone in the rest of the world is allowed to read and allowed to understand.
Is there no public interest then in allowing Julian Assange to stand trial and to talk about this on a public stage, rather than hiding away in the Ecuadorian embassy?
I've observed far too many US Espionage Act cases in the States to be able to agree to that. It's not a process in which you're allowed to put any public interest arguments, and this is happening to Reality Winner in the States at the moment. It's an incredibly biased and unfair process. I mean, look, Edward Snowden is another one of Courage's beneficiaries, and he's said many times that if there were a legal process in the States that he could submit himself to and be able to put his argument, then he'd consider doing it. But there isn't, so that's why he's in Russia. And I don't think there's any question that what would await Julian Assange in the States would be absolutely horrible. If you think about what happened to Chelsea Manning in detention, I mean, she was effectively tortured in detention for a period of 9 months. That's exactly what awaits Julian if he gets extradited. And that is why, you know, Courage and or Julian supporters, and and I hope an increasing number, we're not going to let that happen.
Can I just jump in for a second here?
Sure, go ahead.
The criminal justice system in the U.S. is so backwards and so oppressive. He would have absolutely no chance, beyond a Kafkaesque, if he were to come to this country. The federal prosecutors have a 99% conviction rating. And in the case of Lori Love, the reason why he was not sent over here is because the judge recognized how bad the prison conditions are in the U.S. These are third world prisons that we have in the U.S., particularly the ones that are supermaxes, and that's where Julian would be headed. And I hope people in London kind of speak out against this. This reflects upon the British citizenry by not coming out and supporting Julian Assange. Let's remember Lord Mansfield, okay? In the case of Somerset versus Stewart, the air was too free for there to be a slave in Great Britain. Well, is it too free for a journalist not to live in Britain?
Well, in the case of Julian Assange, it looks like he's going to spend a bit more time at the Ecuadorian embassy, and we don't know what's going to happen. We're going to have to leave the discussion there. Thank you very much indeed to all my guests for joining me, and thank you. That's it for this edition of Roundtable. See you next time.